Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're wrestling with a body of source material that really demands our full attention.
We certainly are.
We're looking at the collected writings of a figure who goes by the name Elwin Ransom, published back in 2025 under the title God, King, and Nation.
And I think it's fair to say this is not light reading. It's dense, it's highly polemical, and it builds a really radical ideological construct.
A construct based on what exactly? What's the core of it?
Ransom's work is, you could call it an aggressive synthesis. He's weaving together a very, very strict interpretation of Orthodox Christian traditionalism,
Okay.
a fierce, almost absolute commitment to monarchy as the only legitimate form of governance,
Right.
and finally a specific brand of anti-liberal nationalism that's, almost metaphysical in its scope.
So as the title suggests, those three pillars, God, King, and Nation, they're not separate ideas.
Not at all. They're inseparable. They define everything for him, from his historical analysis all the way down to his political strategy.
And that pseudonym, Elwin Ransom, that's a pretty deliberate choice, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's borrowed from the protagonist of C.S. Lewis's Cosmic Trilogy.
Which immediately tells you something about his frame of reference.
It does. He doesn't see himself as just another commentator on contemporary politics. He sees himself as engaged in a kind of cosmic, spiritual, almost existential battle for the soul of the West.
A battle against what he calls the liberal disease.
Frequently, yes.
So our mission here, for you, the learner, is to take this really complex material, which, as you said, spans theology, historical revisionism, political theory, and break it down.
Right. We want to break it down into clear, digestible thematic areas. Ransom himself says his hope is to help people pursue truth, and our goal is to understand his version of that truth by synthesizing these often very challenging arguments.
And before we really jump in, we have to do our impartiality check. It's crucial for a text like this.
Absolutely essential.
We have to note that the source material we're covering contains some extreme and politically charged content. We're talking about the defense of highly controversial historical figures, a really thorough anti-modernity stance.
And even philosophical justifications for historical institutions like slavery.
Exactly. So our role here is strictly analytical. It's journalistic. We are unpacking and reporting on the arguments that Ransom makes.
We're providing context for how he justifies them, but we are absolutely not offering any endorsement or agreement with his conclusions.
We're here to map the architecture of his ideology. Nothing more.
And that mapping begins really with the spiritual cornerstone that Ransom places above everything else.
The figure he venerates not just as a political leader,
but as a spiritual confessor.
Okay, let's dive right into that foundational inspiration. Because Ransom's anchor, the figure he returns to again and again for both spiritual and political guidance, is Corneliu Zelia Codreanu.
And that is a massive claim to make.
It is. For our listeners, Codreanu was the founder and leader of the Iron Guard, the Romanian fascist movement that was also known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael.
And Ransom doesn't just admit this connection, he elevates it. He frames Codreanu as the spiritual fulfillment of a philosophical journey that, for him, began when he first discovered the ideas of Julius Evola and Alexander Dugin.
So Evola and Dugin were the theory.
Exactly. They provided the intellectual framework for traditionalism, for Eurasianism, but Ransom sees Codreanu as the practical, the lived, the orthodox expression of those ideas. He was the one who actually went out and built a spiritualized political movement.
He even attributes his own conversion to the Orthodox faith and his dedication to it, partly to Codreanu's influence.
He does, though he's careful to note that the primary spiritual credit belongs to Tsar St. Nicholas II. He sees the Tsar as the true martyr, the ultimate spiritual guide.
So where does that place Codreanu?
Codreanu is positioned as the active exemplar of faith in the modern political arena, the soldier of Christ, in a way.
And the depth of this devotion. It becomes undeniable when you look at the text he chooses to highlight.
The Akathist to Cornelius Codreanu, confessor for the Orthodox faith.
Can you explain for our listeners what an akathist is? Why is this so significant?
Well, an akathist in the Orthodox tradition is a solemn hymn of praise. You stand while it's being sung, and it's reserved almost exclusively for recognized saints or for major feasts of the church.
So to compose one for Codreanu is a huge statement.
It's a radical statement. It's essentially treating him as a saint.
And this wasn't even written by Ransom himself, was it?
No, and this is a crucial detail. He notes it was composed by a spiritual son of the highly respected father Justin Parvu of Petrovoda Monastery.
Why is that detail so important?
Because it implies that Ransom isn't some isolated extremist making this up. He's tapping into a pre-existing, a non-sanctioned veneration within specific segments of the Orthodox traditionalist community.
So there's a belief system already there.
A belief system where Codreanu is already considered a saint before God, regardless of the lack of any formal canonization by the Romanian Orthodox Church. Ransom is asserting a kind of spiritual recognition that precedes, and maybe even challenges, the formal institutional process.
And this leads us directly to the primary defense Ransom offers for this intense veneration.
Yes, and it hinges on a very specific, very powerful historical claim.
The evidence of his incorruptibility after death.
Exactly, which in the Orthodox tradition is seen as one of the strongest proofs of holiness.
So what's the story he presents?
Ransom gives a lengthy historical account of Codreanu's assassination in 1938 by King Carol II's executioners. He claims they were instructed not just to kill him, but to eliminate any possibility of relics being formed.
So to erase him physically.
Completely. According to Ransom's sources, they allegedly poured acid and concrete directly onto his grave, burying him in a crude, remote location. The narrative is almost hagiographic, painting the executioners as fearing the sanctity of the man himself.
And then comes the exhumation in 1940.
Yes, and the details cited from Vesa Pastuca's account are truly striking.
What did they claim to find?
Pastuca describes the body being found whole, undecomposed, standing upright as if it were still alive.
And the details Ransom stresses are the physical signs of sanctity, right?
Yes. He claims the small prayer book, St. Anthony's Prayers, and the crosses around his neck were completely intact, untouched by dampness, acid, or the soil.
And the body itself?
The claim is that it was incorruptible. White skin, and in some accounts, even pink-blooded veins, suggesting a miraculous preservation from natural decay.
This claim of incorruptibility is what he uses to justify everything else.
It's the linchpin. He uses this specific, documented account to justify the inclusion of the akathist and the veneration of the legionary movement as a spiritual, faith-based force.
Now, despite this intense personal devotion Ransom is, he's careful to address the structure of humility within his faith, isn't he?
He is. He's very careful. He explicitly states that the judgment of the Church is the highest. Meaning, if the Romanian Orthodox Church were to officially condemn Codreanu, or if his own bishop instructed him to delete the hymn, he commits to complying.
So that's a crucial tension point. He's publishing material that challenges the institutional church.
While at the same time acknowledging the supreme authority of that very institution, it implies a belief that the official church is maybe in error right now or under pressure, but that its ultimate spiritual authority is non-negotiable.
And this spiritual emphasis, he argues, is carried over into the language of the akathist itself.
Yes, he requires the reader to distinguish between Codreanu's political activity and his spiritual role. Ransom notes that the akathist specifically venerates the spiritual aspect of the legionary movement, arguing that to confuse the two is to just fundamentally misunderstand the text.
He's an example, right? The line calling Codreanu the captain of the legion and through it of the nation.
Right. Politically, that's meaningless. Codreanu was never a head of state.
But spiritually.
Spiritually, Ransom interprets it to mean he became the spiritual guide for the nation's revival, the one who inspired a movement of faith, duty, and sacrifice.
This need to sort of mediate the polemic for a wider audience, it's also really evident in the editorial choices made by the translator, a man named Caleb.
It is. Ransom notes that the original Romanian text of one of the prayers, the Kontakion, refers to sacrifices that shame the Jews, Bolsheviks, and pagans.
Which is extremely inflammatory language. So what was the rationale for changing it?
The translator, Caleb, explains in a note that he changed shame the Jews to shame the Pharisees.
Why Pharisees?
To specifically avoid, in his words, incitement to ethnic disdain. The shift, which Ransom notes approvingly, generalizes the critique. Pharisee becomes a theological historical concept.
The opponents of Christ in the scriptures.
Exactly. It's leveraging a concept that's clearly understood within Christian scripture, referring to the rabbinic tradition from which he claims modern Judaism is derived.
And they make similar edits about nationalism too, right?
Yes, where the original stanzas referred specifically to helping the Romanian to overcome the evil within him, the translation generalized Romanian to common man.
Making it more universal.
It makes the akathist applicable to the spiritual revival of any traditional nation, not just one specific ethnicity. These decisions show a real strategic awareness.
They know the original language is too incendiary for a common Western reader.
They want to extract the underlying spiritual message, the duty, the sacrifice, the anti-modernity, and present it as a universal model for traditionalists while trying to minimize the explicit ethnic nationalism.
And speaking of the legionary legacy, its strange staying power, Ransom highlights a truly striking historical paradox to support his idea.
The 1962 Romanian postage stamp.
This part is fascinating.
It's where it gets really interesting. The Iron Guard was brutally suppressed, first by the king and then even more violently by the communist regime that followed.
And yet, in 1962, the officially anti-religious, anti-nationalist communist government of Romania issued a postage stamp.
A stamp honoring Ion Moia and Vesela Marin.
Who were they?
Two central, deeply faithful figures of the Iron Guard, ardent anti-communists who fell fighting in the Spanish Civil War.
And what did the stamp look like?
It depicts them. It features the Archangel Michael, the patron saint of the Legion, with the legionary cross on his shield, and the inscription, Crusaders of Europe.
A communist government issuing a stamp with crusaders and religious symbols. How does Ransom explain that?
He argues that this bizarre historical artifact is proof that the soul of the Romanian people could not be suppressed. The socialist ideology, despite all its power and violence, was compelled to accommodate this powerful national and spiritual sentiment.
It had to begrudgingly honor these figures to maintain some connection to the authentic, deep desires of the nation.
And this is the perfect bridge to his critique of modern liberalism.
Right. He notes the profound irony. A totalitarian socialist state tolerated, even honored, these symbols in a twisted attempt to co-opt their power.
Yet modern liberal freedom in the West often bans or censors such historical and national symbols outright.
So he's setting up the claim that modern liberalism, with its focus on moral purity and censorship, is actually less accommodating to deeply held spiritual and national beliefs than even a totalitarian atheistic regime was.
Exactly. The socialist state, in his view, was forced by the vigor of the national soul to acknowledge its heroes, whereas the liberal state just tries to erase them entirely. This is why he rejects the foundational principles of that liberal system. Which brings us to his next major theme.
That is a powerful pivot. So we move now from that spiritual and historical touchstone to the philosophical heart of Ransom's political thought.
His radical rejection of equality and his embrace of hierarchy and duty.
He starts by defining freedom, doesn't he?
Yes, and it's a very rigid definition. He states that the Canada of old was defined by freedom, which he says is the ability to do that which is just.
So it's not individual license. It's not do whatever you want.
Not at all. It is the capacity for virtuous, righteous action. And from this specific definition, he derives his core political axiom.
Equality is the ruin of liberty. Okay, let's unpack that. It's a total inversion of modern Western values. How on earth does he justify the claim that equality ruins liberty?
He sees freedom not as a right granted by a constitution or law, but as an inherent faculty, something endowed by God.
The faculty.
Like a talent.
Exactly like that. He argues that just as individuals are born with widely differing levels of intelligence or physical strength or artistic talent, they are also born, in his words, more or less free.
So true liberty, that ability to act justly, is rare.
Very rare. It requires immense responsibility, self-control, and often suffering and pain to maintain. It's not a default state.
And he applies this very selective lens to history, using Canadian examples. His interpretation of the Indian Act of 1876 is, well, it's stark.
It is. He argues that the act was not an attempt to establish inequality, but was in fact a legal recognition that the indigenous population, due to their unique cultural development and differing social organization, do not possess freedom to the same degree that Canadians do. And he holds this interpretive ground, even while acknowledging the stated goals of programs like residential schools.
Yes, which he describes as attempts, however noble in their aims, to uplift and civilize the population. For Ransom, the fundamental belief remains. Freedom is an earned capacity based on a people's ability to govern themselves and adhere to the moral order.
It's not a universal entitlement that you could just legislate into existence.
No. And this inherent anti-equality principle extends directly into his rejection of meritocracy and social mobility, which he sees as destructive forces in any well-ordered traditional society.
So what's the problem with meritocracy? Isn't that supposed to be a good thing?
Not for Ransom. He maintains that every successful historical civilization practiced social separation and hierarchy. He believes society functions through clear, divinely or naturally ordained roles.
Where the lower classes provide essential resources.
Right, for the higher classes, the nobility, the clergy, the intellectuals. intellectuals to sustain and develop high culture.
So he critiques our modern fixation on merit, arguing that it's just circumstantial.
Circumstantial and fleeting? Let's go back to the analogy he uses. The peasant farmer, who is a really good carpenter or blacksmith.
Okay.
What's the real philosophical cost when that farmer leaves the field to pursue a trade based on his individual talent?
Right. What's wrong with that?
Ransom argues the cost is measured in cultural and familial continuity. By pursuing merit outside of his generational commitment to farming, the farmer upsets the order of society and its familial basis.
So the established blacksmith who has committed his life and trained his son in the trade is unjustly usurped.
Exactly. The upstart's interests are likely fleeting. The generational knowledge and the spiritual commitment to that role are lost.
So it's not just about economic efficiency for him, it's about a spiritual and cultural economy.
Absolutely. The underlying anxiety is that culture and high civilization require specialized bloodlines and generations of committed duty to sustain.
So for Ransom, social mobility is not the elevation of the lower class.
It is the debasement of the higher.
How so? How does that work?
He calls it an inversion. Newly elevated individuals, lacking the historical commitment and the refined character of a true nobility, they retain the disposition and often the tastes of the lower classes.
And when they ascend to positions of power?
They promote a debased, consumerist culture because they lack the necessary spiritual and intellectual foundation to preserve a higher one. This, he says, is why an authentic nobility cannot exist in modernity.
It's been genetically and culturally diluted by this inversion.
And he ties this explicitly to modern scientific thought. He references the work of Dr. Edward Dutton, stating that class serves as a proxy for genetic relatedness.
Which makes marriage outside one's class not just a social error, but a biological one.
Yes, problematic for preserving the high cultural bloodlines necessary for rule and for spiritual refinement. For Ransom, when individuals marry outside their class, their offspring are, in his words, cursed to wander the earth deciphering their own meaning and purpose, because that stable genetic and cultural framework has been destroyed.
This intense philosophical commitment to duty, hierarchy, and non-equality. It really provides the necessary foundation for his next, very controversial discussion.
On slavery. Yes.
His logic is, if you reject liberalism and equality, then slavery becomes less inherently monstrous and requires a historical and philosophical justification, especially given its presence in the Bible.
Right. He is careful to break down the institution historically. He starts with classical slavery and serfdom, where the enslaved were primarily war losers, criminals, or debtors.
And crucially, he stresses that in this context, the worker was not of lesser innate value than the owner.
Correct. They often shared a mutual culture, religion, and understanding, which, at least in theory, established boundaries and a shared moral universe.
He then contrasts this with what he calls Christian slavery,
which he claims was comparably benign to Islamic or Jewish systems, which he says were more prone to practices like castration or working slaves to death.
And the Christian slave owner, in Ransom's view, had a sacred non-negotiable duty
to provide for the physical and, most importantly, the spiritual needs of their slaves. Their salvation was part of the owner's responsibility.
This is where he brings in Aristotle.
Yes, Aristotle's concept of natural slavery, the idea that some people are naturally inclined towards servitude and others toward rule.
And Ransom argues this aptitude for subjection is a trait that's likely hereditary, a lack of that faculty for freedom we talked about earlier.
But, and this is a radical philosophical distinction he makes, he explicitly states that this Aristotelian concept does not justify enslavement based on race.
How does he separate those two concepts? Because historically they've been deeply intertwined.
He argues that the modern race-based slavery of the Americas was a corruption of the classical model. It was fueled by economics and biological materialism, not by a philosophical recognition of inherent duty or natural aptitude.
So for Ransom, the aptitude for subjection is an internal spiritual deficit.
Exactly, the inability to govern one's own appetites. And that can appear in any ethnicity. So to target a person based on skin color is to commit the modern error of biological determinism. The true mark of servitude, for him, is the internal lack of self-control.
This distinction allows him to defend the concept of hierarchy and subjection while rejecting the modern, historically American, racial application of the institution.
And this leads to his powerful conclusion, why slavery cannot exist today.
What's his reasoning?
He argues that the West cannot have slaves because she is not worthy of them. This is a profound critique of the potential master, not the slave.
So the loss of the institution is actually a sign of Western degradation.
That's it, exactly. He claims that in a debased, inverted society, the modern Western master would inevitably lose control, seeking to emulate the slave's mannerisms and promoting further cultural degradation. The loss of the ability to govern others reflects the West's primary failure.
The loss of its own faculty for freedom.
The ability to lead and control itself. It's a self-governance deficit that has made the West unfit for any position of true authority.
Having established that rejection of liberalism and the necessity of hierarchy, Ransom then turns his focus geographically.
He defines the boundaries of his ideal society through a very specific Canadian nationalism.
And he constantly laments what he calls the betrayal of old Canada. He sees his country not as just an offshoot of Britain, but as the potential fulfillment of old Europe.
Meant to be its perfected traditionalist form, standing in stark contrast to the American project, which he sees as the antithesis of European tradition.
And he places the blame for Canada's perceived liberal decline almost entirely on the United States.
Yes, arguing that it systematically imposed cultural and economic constraints on its northern neighbor, specifically to prevent the emergence of a peer competitor.
The classic historical example he uses here is the 1959 cancellation of the Avro Arrow project.
Right. For listeners who might not be familiar, that Avro Arrow was a revolutionary Canadian interceptor jet, years ahead of its time. Its cancellation led to the physical destruction of the prototypes and a massive brain drain of Canadian aerospace talent to the U.S.
And Ransom frames this not as just an economic or political decision.
No, he sees it as an existential attack on Canadian technological and industrial sovereignty, orchestrated by American interests. The cancellation, in his view, ensured Canada remained a resource colony and a market, incapable of asserting genuine military or industrial independence.
It confirmed its status as an American vassal.
And this perceived American threat is what drives his extreme monarchical loyalty. He readily admits his material life would be infinitely better if he were an American citizen, but he argues that annexation would cause Canada to cease to be Canadian, and most critically, it would eliminate the king.
And the king, for him, is the singular necessary condition for any political improvement.
Yes, for the restoration of Canadian identity. The king embodies the fidelity of the loyalists who fled the American Revolution, representing a refusal to accept the Enlightenment project. The king is the metaphysical anchor of the nation's spiritual purpose.
This is why he makes that astonishing statement that rule by China, or the World Economic Forum, is preferable to American vassalage.
But provided Canada retains the king. He sees those other entities as foreign powers that can be resisted, while American absorption would eliminate the foundational identity needed for resistance altogether.
This existential fear of Americanized liberalism leads to his detailed analysis of the contemporary Canadian elite, especially in the post-Trudeau era.
Yes, he critiques the conservative figure, Pierre Poilievre, for lacking deep ideological roots, but he saves his most pointed analysis for the liberal Mark Carney.
Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and presumed successor to the liberal leadership, Ransom sees him as expertly positioned to flank the conservatives culturally.
He interprets Carney's public moves, like his visit to Britain to affirm Canada's European heritage, receiving an audience from the king, as highly strategic.
And Carney's claim that Canada is the most European of non-European countries. Ransom sees that as a masterstroke of liberal strategy.
He does. He sees it as an attempt to co-opt national symbols and traditional nostalgia, the very things Ransom values, to legitimize a fundamentally modern, socially liberal, post-national agenda.
So he's not condemning Carney for acknowledging the European past, but for strategically denying the traditional values that past represented.
Exactly. Ransom believes Carney seeks to create a liberal Canadian identity that affirms the British, monarchical, and European heritage structurally, while denying the actual historical values, the Christian faith, the hierarchy, the duty that those structures were built on.
It's an empty appropriation, a shell game.
Designed to neuter any conservative opposition. But this is also where Ransom's nationalist hope emerges. He believes that if a true Canadian nationalism is ever released,
if the inherent traditional identity is given space to breathe,
it will be too vigorous to be contained by the liberal elite's co-opting efforts. This clash, he argues, will ultimately falsify the modern philosophy of progress.
And this philosophical battle is what leads him into one of the most esoteric parts of his text.
The occult interpretation of the Canadian flag and the maple leaf.
He admits his interest in the occult is limited, but he uses these traditions to dissect the metaphysical meaning of national symbols. He notes the colors red for England, white for Bourbon France.
And he points out they match the colors of the philosopher's stone in alchemy.
Red and white.
It's a direct reference to the alchemical process, the sequence of dissolution, purification, and perfection. Ransom sees the core ideology of modern liberal Canada as operating under the principle of solve, a coagula, dissolve, and reform.
So if the national project is to dissolve and reform, what does the maple leaf itself symbolize in this interpretation?
He interprets the maple leaf as the symbolic new Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel, where God scattered the nations.
Right. And the maple leaf, in this view, symbolizes a place where all nations are made one in a common secular identity, actively undoing God's original act of scouring of the nations. It's the unifying symbol of the liberal post-national project.
That's a profoundly bleak reading of a national symbol.
It is. And this connects directly with his critique of contemporary power structures, particularly the presence of what he calls ethnic elites, and the question of national parasitism.
He points to the disproportionate number of Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim members of parliament relative to their population percentage.
He uses the example of Jagmeet Singh, noting his fervent support for Sikh identity and independence. Ransom argues that representatives who prioritize specific ethnic religious group interests use governmental power, which should serve the core Canadian nation to benefit their own groups instead.
But crucially, Ransom doesn't really blame these representatives.
No, he says he can't fault them for using the tools of power to push policies beneficial to their own communities. His real critique is reserved for the traditional Euro-Canadian elite,
who, he claims, have abandoned their own interests and the interests of the nation's historical founders by failing to assert a coherent, self-interested nationalism.
And this leads to the fundamental philosophical dilemma he poses to traditionalists. Are they parasitical?
How so?
They oppose modern culture and liberalism, yet they rely on the state's social services and stability. So the system is, in effect, subsidizing its own destruction by sustaining those who reject its core values.
That is a powerful challenge.
It is, and Ransom argues that to escape this parasitic label, traditionalists must adopt an active strategy focused on creating social capital and self-sufficiency.
Forming communities. Building resilient local economies.
And, most importantly, raising children who are rigorously indoctrinated to perpetuate their traditional views.
So the path to victory isn't through mass politics right now.
No, it's through spiritual and cultural preparation. By proving themselves superior in conduct and capacity, the traditionalists will transform themselves from perceived cultural parasites into a genuine future elite, eventually becoming the best representatives of our society, a spiritual elite capable of governing.
We shift now to the final pillar of Ransom's ideology, Orthodox Christianity, which he defines not just by its beliefs, but by its rigorous, non-negotiable exclusivity.
And he starts with one of the most contentious topics in modern interfaith dialogue.
Is the God of Christianity the God of Muhammad?
Right. And Ransom immediately establishes his position by contrasting it with what he sees as the modern Catholic stance. He quotes the Second Vatican Council document Lumen Gentium, which states Muslims, along with us, adore the one and merciful God.
He also references Pope John Paul II's alleged actions, kissing a Quran, asking St. John the Baptist to protect Islam, as emblematic of Rome's position.
And this is the position he rejects wholesale. For Ransom, accepting that the Christian God is the same as the Islamic God would logically mean accepting Muhammad as a legitimate prophet,
who was guided by divine revelation to teach about the Orthodox God.
Which, he argues, is a theological impossibility for any Christian body.
So, to anchor this rejection, he delves deep into Byzantine history.
Citing the historical requirement for Muslim converts in Constantinople before the year 1180 to anathematize the God of Muhammad.
Let's spend some time on this specific historical argument. The term used to describe and condemn the Muslim god in this anathema was holosphairos.
Yes, holosphairos. It literally translates to something like all hammered or solid metal beaten into a spherical shape.
That seems incredibly specific.
It was an intentional, deeply offensive theological insult. In Islamic theology, Allah is understood as the uncreated, invisible, completely transcendent God of oneness.
And the Byzantine clergy used holosphairos to reject that concept.
Yes. By calling the Islamic god a holosphairos, the clergy transformed the concept of divine oneness into a mockery of idolatry. They were implying the God of Islam was a beaten, man-made idol, like a crude sphere of metal. It was a direct intellectual challenge to the legitimacy of the Quranic description.
And a total rejection of Muhammad's claimed prophecy.
Absolutely. It highlights the uncompromising theological separation that Ransom believes should still be enforced today.
This whole thing came to a head in 1180, when the Emperor Manophanes on. I tried to remove this highly inflammatory statement from the liturgy.
Right, likely to avoid offending Muslim subjects or allies in his realm. But the clergy were uncompromising. They argued that removing the anathema would implicitly legitimize Muhammad.
So what was the outcome?
While the specific reference to Holus Pharos was eventually removed by imperial decree, the clergy successfully demanded its replacement with further explicit denunciations of Muhammad and the core tenets of Islam.
Ransom sees this as a crucial historical victory for the Church.
Yes, the clergy successfully protected the purity of doctrine against imperial political expediency.
And he contrasts this historical rigor with modern Orthodox leaders, like Patriarch Kirill.
He criticizes them for making statements that suggest commonality, which Ransom views not as diplomacy but as ecumenical submission, signaling an uncertainty in the truth of orthodoxy.
Now, shifting internally within Christian theology, Ransom tackles a complex, historically divisive issue,
The hardening of Pharaoh's heart in Exodus.
which is often used to support a very strict form of predestination. How does the Orthodox view, which Ransom adheres to, counter the argument that God actively willed Pharaoh to sin?
Ransom staunchly rejects the idea that God wills evil. He believes God permits evil as a necessary result of human free choice and can use that evil for ultimate good, but evil is never actively mandated. Strict predestination, he argues, is a bleak and inaccurate anthropology.
He clarifies this action using the analogy of Christ killing the fig tree. Can you explain that connection?
Sure. The fig tree wasn't killed randomly. It was killed because it was found defective. It bore no fruit when it should have.
Okay.
Similarly, Pharaoh was not born predamned. He had already rejected God's principles throughout his life, exercising his free will to choose evil. Christ, as the Logos, didn't inflict a new evil upon him, but rather performed a kind of surgical withdrawal of sustaining divine energies.
So by removing that grace, Pharaoh's own internal evil choice, his hardened will, was just allowed to fully manifest.
Precisely. He was cut off from divine sustenance because he was defective. The hardening was God ratifying Pharaoh's own choice, not initiating it.
And this theological point is vital because it links directly back to his anti-liberal political theory.
It does. If you adopt a bleak view rooted in strict predestination or total depravity, the idea that humans are innately sinful from birth, what are the moral consequences?
According to Ransom.
Ransom argues it leads directly to the devaluation of human life. If a child is fundamentally sinful from the womb, then theological coherence can lead to the horrifying conclusion that they are more worthy of death than it is life. He connects this directly to modern secular degradation, like justifications for abortion based on depravity.
So affirming the innate innocence and full human potential at conception is a necessary theological defense for human dignity.
And for the traditionalist view of creation itself.
Finally, Ransom addresses what he calls problematic saints and the internal landscape of orthodoxy.
He reiterates the normatively exclusionary view. To be a saint, you must be an adherent of orthodoxy. To assume salvation exists widely outside the visible church removes the obligation to evangelize.
He does acknowledge one historical exception, right?
Yes, the pagan emperor Trajan, who was granted salvation through the prayers of St. Gregory the Great. But Ransom stresses that Trajan is not considered a saint because he was never Christian. He's not an exemplar of faith, just a redeemed soul.
He then discusses two non-Orthodox figures canonized by ROKOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia.
Alexei Trupp, who was Catholic, and Catherine Schneider, who was Lutheran. Both were servants of the Romanovs.
So how does Ransom justify their sainthood if they weren't Orthodox?
He interprets their shared suffering with the martyred Romanov family as a kind of spiritual exceptionalism. He argues that their proximity to living saints, their shared journey to Golgotha, essentially acted as a deathbed conversion, a baptism through blood and fire, solidifying them as saints of and for orthodoxy.
This focus on strict internal theological purity then leads to his critique of world orthodoxy.
He cites the example of Saint Glycery of Romania, a founder of the old-style Romanian Orthodox Church who was canonized by the true Orthodox Communion.
And Ransom argues that if these true Orthodox synods, which exist outside the state-aligned world orthodoxy jurisdictions, can produce holy saints, it challenges the establishment.
It suggests that the true Orthodox groups who maintain a stricter traditional calendar and a less ecumenical stance may be more correct in their theological orientation than the mainstream acknowledges.
His final point in this section is a warning about liturgical diversity, specifically the Antiochian Western Rite.
Which borrows elements from post-Sigdism Roman liturgies. Ransom sees this as a potential vector for theological contamination. He views it as a perennialist halfway house, potentially leading adherents to apostasy and ecumenical compromise by importing theological concepts from Roman Catholicism.
He agrees liturgical diversity can exist as long as theology is perfectly preserved, but he champions the Byzantine Rite's pedigree and stability. He's intensely wary of any Western Rite that hasn't achieved the same history, especially if it risks importing theological errors.
Moving now from the ideological foundation to practical action, Ransom outlines his strategy for traditionalists operating within the modern liberal sphere. He starts with a controversial defense of gatekeepers.
Gatekeepers, figures like Bill Whittle, Ben Shapiro, maybe early Tucker Carlson. He defines them as commentators who speak truth up to a certain acceptable limit, but refuse to challenge the fundamental liberal or democratic assumptions of the system.
And they are often reviled by the authentic right for being controlled opposition.
But Ransom flips this critique entirely.
He defends them as a necessary evil. He sees them as a selection vector. Their purpose is explicitly not mass conversion. Instead, their limited truths serve to sift from the masses those who are of actual use.
Okay, how does that sifting mechanism work in practice?
The gatekeeper provides acceptable grievances, economic nationalism, anger at illegal immigration, critique of media bias. The masses follow them because they're palatable.
Right.
However, anyone capable of realizing that the gatekeeper stops short, anyone who moves beyond acceptable economic grievance to a spiritualized critique of modernity, hierarchy, and God's role in politics is, by definition, the person the traditionalist movement wants.
They're the ones capable of synthesizing the complex arguments Ransom is making, the ones with that high faculty for freedom.
Precisely. Anyone incapable of seeing past the gatekeeper's predefined limits is simply not worthy or capable of entering the ranks of the authentic elite. The goal is influencing or creating a new elite, not winning a mass popularity contest.
Because once the right elite is in power, the masses will just follow the new dominant culture.
That's his view. He illustrates the stakes here using the hypothetical assassination of a figure like Charlie Kirk. He argues that even the moderate right needs a voice, and the silence from that loss would be detrimental because the masses are not ready, worthy, or capable of entering into the ranks of the authentic right. They need that intermediate step.
This pragmatism leads directly to his core strategy for daily life. Walk away.
Which is not an endorsement of powerlessness, but a deliberate tactical retreat.
But wait, if Ransom advocates focusing boundless power on one's family, property, and self, isn't that a direct contradiction of his earlier claim that the elite need to be built to eventually seize control?
But that is the great structural question his strategy answers.
How does building a self-sufficient community lead to political power if you refuse to engage in the political fight?
Walk away is the necessary first step of building the internal fortress. He sees the stress from engaging in high-level politics, worrying about tariffs, national elections, as a total waste of energy on things outside one's control.
So, Christians must be loyal, follow laws, pray for leaders, but reject wasting energy on systemic change they can't influence.
Exactly. The power isn't meant to be used politically right now. It's meant to be secured and accumulated internally.
By building resilient communities, raising disciplined children, and focusing on one's local spiritual life.
It's a long-term, multi-generational strategic vision that has to come before any attempt at seizing power. He even closes this argument by citing the Serenity Prayer as valuable theology.
God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference.
The emphasis is entirely on distinguishing between that inner duty, which is changeable, and the external chaos, which is not.
This focus on duty over despair leads directly to his rejection of apocalypticism.
In his section, Against the End, Ransom criticizes the fixation on the end times, especially rapture or dispensational theology, as it causes Christians to abandon their fundamental duty to creation, their nation, and future generations.
Why does he see rapture theology as so destructive to that sense of duty?
Because it fosters fatalism and abandonment. We are stewards of creation. Our labor, our work, our pure love is meant to transform creation into an offering back to God.
And if you believe God is just going to whisk you away before the final act,
You're excused from that responsibility of continuous labor and stewardship. To abandon labor is to abandon duty, and therefore to abandon love for God's creation.
He finds that position theologically unsound.
He does. He asserts that God deliberately obscured the end time so that we would persist and overcome. He fully rejects the idea that God, who allowed his own mother and millions of martyrs to face terrible deaths, would spare his followers the end we are all owed. This fixation on escape causes political negligence.
In a deeply provocative conclusion, Ransom argues the end times will only commence as a result of Christian negligence.
Yes, at a time where true faith and true religion is nearing its end. The end, in his view, is not a predetermined event we just wait for. It's the consequence of our collective failure to sanctify creation.
He applies this perspective to contemporary political failure, noting leaders like Trump were ultimately inconsistent, beholden to other powers.
And figures like Mark Carney, while possibly effective, are still operating within a post-national liberal framework. They lack the necessary ideological fortitude.
So nihilistic determinism, the sense that it's all collapsing anyway, is tempting, but Ransom says it is fundamentally erroneous.
Despair is resignation to evil, a product of decadency used by the lazy to justify inaction. The solution, he concludes, is continuous spiritual uplift, conducting our lives.
What does this all mean?
What Ransom attempts throughout God, King, and Nation is a systematic effort to reconstruct reality. It's based on a strict, hierarchical, spiritualized nationalism rooted in a very exclusive view of Orthodox Christianity.
His entire structure demands a rigid definition of duty and fidelity, first to God, then to the king, then family, then nation. The whole philosophical underpinning of his work is defining what is owed.
And establishing what actions flow from those obligations, often resulting in political positions that seem, completely paradoxical to the modern mind.
The synthesis is stark. He views the liberal West as fundamentally opposed to the divine and natural order, which forces him to seek solutions in extreme, often forgotten historical figures like Codreanu, and in these highly rigorous theological positions like the Byzantine anathema.
He's looking for anchors in what he sees as a collapsing spiritual sea.
And here we find the great unavoidable paradox that Ransom seems to wrestle with himself.
Which is?
He rejects modernity entirely, yet he is forced to use the tools of the modern permissive system, the liberal democracy he despises, to preserve the traditional alternative.
He has to publish, engage with gatekeepers, benefit from the stability of the very state he calls decadent.
Always risking, as he himself acknowledges, becoming a parasite in the process.
His whole political and cultural strategy hinges on tactically exploiting the freedoms and stability provided by a system he believes is collapsing, while at the same time building an internal, self-governing elite that is meticulously separated from the cultural values of that system.
It's a long game of subversive fidelity.
It is.
The core conflict he presents, and the idea we want to leave you with, to mull over, revolves around that definition of freedom.
Ransom repeatedly stresses that freedom is the ability to do that which is just, and that the decline of the West is due to the loss of the ability to control and lead oneself.
So the question is this: if a society cannot govern its own appetites, what justification does it have to govern others? And if that self-governance deficit is ignored, what long-term compounding price does that failure of duty impose on the generations that follow?
A profound question worth exploring in your own deep dive.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll be back soon with more sources to unpack.